This lakelet was perhaps 100 yards in diameter at its widest part. No crystal could be clearer than its waters. Its bottom, which could be distinctly seen, consisted altogether of pebbles brilliantly white. Its banks of the emerald grass already described, rounded rather than sloped, off into the clear heaven below. And so clear was this heaven, so perfectly at times did it reflect all objects above it, that where the true bank ended and where the mimic one commenced, it was a point of no little difficulty to determine. The trout and some other varieties of fish, with which this pond seemed to be almost inconveniently crowded, had all the appearance of veritable flying fish. It was almost impossible to believe that they were not absolutely suspended in the air. A light birch canoe that lay placidly on the water was reflected in its minutest fibers with a fidelity unsurpassed by the most exquisitely polished mirror. A small island fairly laughing with flowers in full bloom, and affording little more space than just enough for a picturesque little building, seemingly a fowl house, arose from the lake not far from its northern shore, to which it was connected by means of an inconceivably light-looking and yet very primitive bridge. It was formed of a single broad and thick plank of tulip wood. This was 40 feet long and spanned the interval between shore and shore, with a slight but very perceptible arch, preventing in all oscillation. From the southern extreme of the lake issued a continuation of the rivulet, which, after meandering perhaps 30 yards, finally passed through the quote-unquote depression already described in the middle of the southern declivity, and tumbling down on a sheer precipice of 100 feet, made its devious and almost an unnoticed way to the Hudson. The lake was deep, at points 30 feet, but the rivulet seldom exceeded 3, while its greatest width was about 8. Its bottom and banks were as those of the pond. If a defect could be attributed, a point of picturesqueness, it was that of excessive neatness. The expanse of the green turf was relieved here and there by occasional showy shrub, such as the hydrangea, or the common snowball, or the aromatic syringa, or more frequently by a clump of geraniums, blossoming gorgeously in the great varieties. These latter grew in pots which were carefully buried in the soil, so as to give the plants the appearance of being indigenous. Besides all this, the lawn's velvet was exquisitely spotted with sheep. A considerable flock which roamed about the vale, in company with 3 tame deer and a vast number of brilliantly plumed ducks. A very large mastiff seemed to be in vigilant attendance upon these animals, each and all. Along the eastern and western cliffs there, where, toward the upward portion of the amphitheater, the boundaries were more or less precipitous, grew ivy in great profusion, so that only here and there could even a glimpse of the naked rock be obtained. The northern precipice, in like manner, was almost entirely clothed by great vines of rare luxuriance, some springing from the soil at the base of the cliff, and others from ledges on its face. The slight elevation which formed the lower boundary of this little domain was crowned by a neat stone wall of sufficient height to prevent the escape of the deer. Nothing of the fence kind was observable elsewhere, for nowhere else was an artificial enclosure needed. Any stray sheep, for example, which should attempt to make its way out of the vale by means of the ravine, would find its progress arrested after a few yards' advance by the precipitous ledge of rock over which tumbled the cascade that arrested my attention as I first drew near the domain. In short, the only ingress or egress was through a gate occupying a rocky pass in the road, a few paces below the point at which I stopped to reconnoiter the sea. I've described the brook as meandering very irregularly through the whole of its course, as its 2 general directions, as I have said, were first west to east and then north to south. At the turn, the stream sweeping backward made it almost a circular loop, so as to form the peninsula, which was very nearly an island, and which included about the 16th of an acre. On this peninsula stood a dwelling house, and when I say this house, like the infernal terror seen by the thick. État d'une architecture inconnuée dans les annales de la terre. I mean merely that its tout ensemble struck me with the keenest sense of the combined novelty and propriety. In a word, of poetry. For then, in the words just employed, I could scarcely give of poetry in the abstract a more rigorous definition. And I do not mean that merely auteur was perceptible in any respect. In fact, nothing could be more simple, more utterly unpretending than this cottage. Its marvelous effect lay altogether in its artistic arrangement. As a picture, I could have fancied while I looked at it that some eminent landscape painter had built it with its brush. The point of view from which I first saw this valley was not altogether, although it was nearly, the best point from which to survey the house. I will therefore describe it as I afterwards saw it, from a position on the stone wall at the southern extreme of the amphitheater. The main building was about 24 feet long and 16 broad, certainly not more. Its total height from the ground to the apex of the roof could not have exceeded 18 feet. To the west end of this structure was attached one about a third smaller in all its proportions, the line of its front, standing back about 2 yards from that of the larger house, and the line of its roof, of course, being considerably depressed below that of the roof adjoining. At right angles to these buildings, and from the rear of the main one, not exactly in the middle, extended a third compartment, very small being, in general, 1/3 less than the western wing. The roofs of the two larger were very steep and sweeping down from the ridge beam with a long concave curve, and extending at least 4 feet beyond the walls in front, so as to form the roofs of two piazzas. These latter roofs, of course, need no support, but as they had the air of needing it, slight and perfectly plain pillars were inserted at the corners alone. The roof of the northern wing was merely an extension of a portion of the main roof. Between the chief building and western wing arose the very tall and rather slender square chimney of hard Dutch bricks, alternately black and red. A slight cornice of projecting bricks at the top. Over the gables, the roofs also projected very much, and the main building about 4 feet to the east and to the west. The principal door was not exactly in the main division, being a little to the east, while the two windows were to the west. These latter did not extend to the floor, but were much longer and narrower than usual. They had single shutters like doors. The panes were of lozenge form, but quite large. The door itself had its upper roof half of glass, also in lozenge panes. A movable shutter secured it at night. The door to the west wing was in its gable and quite simple. A single window looked out to the south. There was no external door to the west. To the north wing, it also had one window to the east. The blank wall of the eastern gable, which was relieved by stairs with a balustrade running diagonally across it, the ascent being from the south. Under cover of the widely projecting eave, these steps gave access to a door leading into the garret, or rather loft, for it was lighted only by a single window to the north, and seemed to have been intended as a storeroom. The piazzas of the main building and western wing had no floors, as is usual, but at the doors of each window, large, flat, irregular slabs of granite lay embedded in the delicious turf, affording comfortable footing in all weather. Excellent paths of the same material, not nicely adapted, but with a velvety sod filling, intervals between the stones, led hither and thither from the house to a crystal spring about 5 paces off to the road, or to 1 or 2 outhouses that lay to the north, beyond the brook, and more thoroughly concealed by a few locusts and catalpas. Not more than 6 steps from the main door of the cottage stood the dead trunk of a fantastic pear tree, so clothed from head to foot in the gorgeous begonias, blossoms, that one required no little scrutiny to determine what manner of sweet thing it could be. From various arms of this tree hung cages of different kinds. In one, a large wicker cylinder with a ring at the top, reveled a mockingbird. In another, an oriole. In a third, the impudent bobolink, while 3 or 4 more delicate prisons were loudly vocal with canaries. The pillars of the piazza were enwreathed in jasmine and sweet honeysuckle, while from the angle formed by the main structure in its west wing in front sprang a grapevine of unexampled luxuriance. Scorning all restraint, it had clambered first to the lower roof, then to the higher, and along the ridge of this latter it continued to writhe on, throwing out tendrils to the right and left until at length it fairly attained to the east gable and fell trailing over the stairs. The whole house, with its wings, was constructed over the old-fashioned Dutch shingles, broad and with its unrounded corners. It is a peculiarity of this material to give houses built the appearance of being wider at bottom than at the top, after the manner of Egyptian architecture, and in the present instance this exceedingly picturesque effect was aided by numerous pots of gorgeous flowers that almost encompassed the base of the buildings. The shingles were painted a dull gray, and the happiness with which this neutral tint melted in the vivid green of the tulip tree leaves that partially overshadowed the cottage can be readily be conceived by an artist. From the position of the stone wall as described, the buildings were seen at great advantage, for the southeastern angle was thrown forward, so that the eye took in at once the whole of 2 fronts, with a picturesque eastern gable, and at the same time obtained just a sufficient glimpse of the northern wing, with parts of a pretty roof to the spring house, and nearly half of the light bridge that spanned the brook in the near vicinity of the main buildings. I did not remain very long on the brow of the hill, although long enough to make a thorough survey of the scene at my feet. It was clear that I had wandered from the road to the village, and I had thus good traveller's excuse to open the gate before me, and inquire my way at all events, so, without more ado, I proceeded. The road passing the gate seemed to lie upon a natural ledge, sloping gradually down along the face of the northeastern hill cliffs. It led me on to the foot of the northern precipice, and thence over the bridge, round by an eastern gable to the front door. In this progress, I took no notice that no sight of the outhouses could be obtained. As I turned the corner of the gable, the mastiff bounded toward me in stern silence, but with the eye and the whole air of a tiger. I held out my hand, however, in token of amity, and never knew yet the dog who was proof against such an appeal to his courtesy. He not only shut his mouth and wagged his tail, but absolutely offered me his paw, afterward extending his civilities to Ponto. As no bell was discernible, I rapped with my stick against the door, which stood half open. Instantly advanced a figure to the threshold, that of a young woman of about 28 years of age, slender, or rather slight, with somewhat above the medium height. As she approached with a certain modest decision of step altogether indescribable, I said to myself, surely here I have found the perfection of natural in contradistinction from artificial grace. The second impression which she made on me, but by far the more vivid of the two, was that of enthusiasm. so intense an expression of romance, perhaps I should call it, or of unworldliness, as that which gleamed from her deep-set eyes had never so sunk into my heart of hearts before.